Today, we will be covering The Death Cure, which is the third book in the Maze Runner series. So if this is my first video you're seeing on the Maze Runner series, definitely check out my other two before you watch this one, and make sure to like and subscribe if you end up enjoying. If you've been keeping up with this series, then you know that I somehow never read the Maze Runner series when I was a kid, so this is my first time reading through the series. And so far, I've thought that the first book, The Maze Runner, had a lot of problems, but was still really fun and interesting, and that the movie got a 3 stars from me as well. But the second book, The Scorch Trials, I hated, gave it a 1 star, still gave the movie a 3 stars. And now we're here to talk about book 3, movie 3, and the finale for both. There are 2 prequel books. They never made movies out of those books, and so I will eventually cover those as well. But as far as the main trilogy of the Maze Runner, The Death Cure is the finale. I'll just tell you right here up front, I somehow enjoyed this one even less than book 2, and so it makes me regret giving book 2 1 star. Now, to be clear, book 2, The Scorch Trials, is a 1-star book, but if I gave that a 1 star, what star rating am I supposed to give this one? So I guess this one gets a 0 stars from me. On Goodreads, it doesn't allow you to give below 1 star. You can just not rate it. So I did still rate it a 1 star on Goodreads, but here on my channel where I make the rules, I'm giving it a 0. It genuinely took me so long to get through it because I just was struggling so bad. So without further ado, let's just dive in so I can introduce you to this monstrosity and vent out my feelings.
Hi friends, I just wanted to pop in here really quickly and say that I am in the process of upgrading some things across the channel. So got a new banner, new little logo in the banner, new little icon for the corner of the video. All of them made by my lovely friend Sam. Please note, I'm very biased. We've been friends for like a decade now and I love her dearly, but I think she did an incredible job. And I think if you have a small business that needs a little bit of brand zhuzhing, then she might be a great person to help you with that. So her website is brainstorming.agency if you're interested. And in the interest of just the fullest disclosure possible, she also did tell me that if any of you did go and work with her because you found out about her through me, then she would give me a little bit of a commission on that. So please keep that in mind as well. But I love my new banner and logo and icon, and I also love her. Now back to the video.
Very, very broad overview of the series up to now. I'll be very quick, I promise. Book number 1 takes place in a maze, and it's a bunch of boys that have just been dropped in this maze. None of them have any memories. They've formed a bit of a society there, and they're trying to get through the maze to get out. Our main character, Thomas, arrives in the situation also without his memories. There's also a girl named Teresa that's dropped off right after Thomas. That book centers on them getting out of the maze and finding out that all of it was a big experiment and they're being studied, and that it has something to do with this apocalypse that happened that was a double whammy of solar flares destroying a bunch of the environment of the world around the equator, and a disease called the flare being released around the same time. At the end of book 1, the boys think that they're rescued by a rebel group that's fighting Wicked, and it seems that they're setting up that the plot of book 2 is going to be the boys thinking they're passing through the Scorch, which is the area that was destroyed by the solar flares, to get the cure, but that we actually, the reader, know that this is the second step in the experiment and that it's actually Wicked doing all of this still. But then they completely abandon that for book 2, and the boys fully know that they are in an experiment for the entirety of book 2. They find out that there was a separate maze that had a group of girls, and it's this whole convoluted, ridiculous plot where they end up essentially right back where they started, which is in Wicked custody. And the only further information we have is that the flare was actually a man-made virus that was a bioweapon, and that the reason that these kids are in this experiment is because most of them are immune to the flare, and so they're studying them to try and figure out why they're immune so that they can create a cure, because they don't have a cure. So when that book ends, the kids are all still in Wicked custody, and Thomas is being kept separate from everybody else in his own white padded room, and he doesn't have any answers. That is what gets us to the beginning of this book 3, The Death Cure. So we start with Thomas in this white padded room, and he spends about 3 weeks in there. They never turn off the lights, they never bathe him, they are giving him food and water, but that's pretty much it. He has nothing to do, and so you can imagine he's slowly going crazy. I don't think he goes nearly crazy enough for the situation they put him in, especially the keeping the lights on, because that is sleep deprivation, and it is well known that sleep deprivation is a torture technique, and it is something that will drive you crazy very quickly. There's so many problems with the realism in this series, and so this seems like such a tiny thing to harp on, but it's just like, wow, in the opening scene, in the first scene we're reading, we already have a situation that's so unrealistic for the character to be reacting the way that they are. He is feeling a little bit crazy by the end of this, but not nearly as crazy as he should be feeling, and the effects of it would have lasted a lot longer than they ended up lasting. So then Jansen, aka Ratman, shows up and tells Thomas that this was phase 3 of his version of the experiment. He explains that they're studying all of the kids' brainwaves to build what they call the patterns, which this is somehow supposed to lead them to the cure. He also explains in a lot more detail about most of the kids in the experiment being immune, and there only being a few that aren't because they're supposed to be the controls. And then they allow Thomas to shower and rejoin all the other kids. And they tell the kids that the experiment isn't quite over yet, but that they want to restore their memories before moving on to the next part because it'll just make everything easier. And Thomas, Minho, and Newt are the only ones who refuse to let them do this. And at first, Wicked is like, yeah, that's fine, you can refuse. And then literally in the same chapter, they're like, yeah, we changed our minds, we're actually going to force you to have the surgery. But through a convoluted series of events that truly actually don't matter, the 3 boys push to escape all at the same time that all of the rest of the kids escape. Bear with me, I know, this makes no sense. I promise I'm recounting to you how it actually happens. It doesn't make sense in the book, okay? So Thomas, Minho, and Newt are separate from all of the rest of the Gladers. That's what they kind of generally refer to all of the kids who had been in the different mazes as. So the rest of the Gladers escape, and these 3 boys specifically escape with Brenda and Jorge. So there's 2 separate escapes that happen at the same time. Everybody else has had their memories restored except for Thomas, Minho, and Newt. And before all of that went down, they were told who is immune and who isn't, and Newt is one of the people who aren't immune. And they tell all of the people who aren't immune that they probably do have the flare because it's so contagious, and they had all just been in the Scorch as a part of this experiment where there are so many cranks. That's what they call people who have the flare. And so presumably Newt has the flare, and presumably this means he is going to die from it soon enough. Oh, also, this is when they find out that Brenda and Jorge were working with Wicked. I said that I thought that that was obvious with book 2, but that I didn't know if that was supposed to be our takeaway. And so when that reveal happened in this book, it wasn't that shocking to me. So Brenda and Jorge were planted in the Scorch Trials experiment by Wicked. So Newt, Minho, and Thomas escape with Brenda and Jorge, and the rest of the Gladers escape separately. And the boys are a little bit offended when they realize the rest of the Gladers have escaped, because they're like, wait a minute, why didn't they come back for us? We were trying to find them during our escape, but whatever, okay. Newt also gives Thomas a note that he tells him to open when the time is right, and says that he knows that Thomas will know when that is. So then they go to Denver. All of them still have chips in their brain that Wicked can control them with and potentially track, and so they want to get rid of those before they pull a full escape, which makes sense. And they think that there's this guy Hans that lives in Denver, which is the last city is what they call it. The last city is crazy. The last city anywhere? That's one of the things that ends up being really unclear with this series, which I actually don't mind as something left a little bit more ambiguous, because I don't know how any of the characters in the series would know what the whole worldwide situation is. But one of the things that ends up being unclear to me throughout the whole events of this series is whether or not some of this stuff is only true in the United States or in the US/Latin America/South America connected landmass, or if this is like a worldwide thing. So when they say the last city, is it the last city they're aware of, and potentially all the way on the southern tip of South America or on other continents in other parts of the world, things are different? Or is Denver the last city on Earth? Which again is something I don't really mind, because I don't understand how the characters in this story would know that. So I'm kind of fine with that being left ambiguous for us, but I am just curious. I'm curious to know, because the last city on Earth is crazy. That would be insane. And what a city for that, like Denver? No offense to Denver. I have nothing against Denver. It just doesn't really feel like the city that would be the last city. It's kind of a random choice, you know? Now, Denver is completely walled off from the rest of the world, and they have very intense procedures to check people going in to ensure that they're not infected with the flare. So all of the cranks are locked out. Once they're there, they're approached by random people and told to go meet with Gally. You remember Gally from the first book? So I guess that he's still around, and he's been working with this rebel group called the Right Arm. And so they go and they meet with Gally, and he explains to them that Wicked is rounding up more immunes to start the experiment over due to the failure of the one that they had been doing. And so Gally and the Right Arm are trying to push back against them and to destroy Wicked, and they're trying to recruit them to join them. Then they find Hans, they get their memory chips removed, but not before Thomas's has some kind of failsafe feature kick in where he is fighting against them removing it, and he's fighting really hard back. Now, this whole entire scene is so frustrating to me, and it's such a marker of what is so wrong with this book, and so I'm going to vent about it for a second. It's like a microcosm of every issue this whole entire series has. First of all, why is it only Thomas's chip that has this failsafe? Because Minho and Newt are there as well, and they also have chips that need to be removed. Why is Thomas's the only one that has some kind of failsafe trigger that will cause him to freak out and mind control him if he's going to remove it? And not only that, but the chip is inside of his brain. And they have said many times that Wicked can't actually see through their eyes or hear through their ears with these chips, but they can control them. How does the chip know that he's about to remove it? Because they've had the plan to remove these chips since they were leaving the Wicked headquarters. So if he had some kind of failsafe in his brain that was supposed to trigger when he was trying to remove the chip, it only makes sense to have triggered either when they were actively trying to remove it, as in doing the surgery, or when Thomas first decided to remove the chip, because that would be a brain thing. But that's not what happens. When they first decide to go try and remove the chips, that doesn't kick in. And it's not when they're actually going to remove the chip. It's like right before. They're actually in the room with Hans, about to have Hans remove the chip, and out of nowhere, Thomas starts freaking out. Why? How did the chip get triggered right in that moment to do that? And why was it only Thomas? Why didn't that happen to Minho? Why didn't it happen to Newt? And not only that, but the other issue with this scene is that Thomas gets knocked out and then they remove his chip, and that's it. And this scene finally gave me the words to explain what feels so pointless about so much of what's happened in this series since the Maze trials ended. I talked in book 2 about how all of the events of that book are essentially completely pointless, because you end up right back where you started, which is all of the kids in Wicked custody, knowing that it's an experiment, and basically nothing else had changed. Despite all of the events of that book, everything was the same. So here we have a multi-page long, entire chapter action sequence of all of the other characters chasing Thomas down, him fighting them, and all this stuff. There's multiple blows landed. He ends up stabbing somebody at some point, I'm pretty sure. And not only does all of that lead to nothing because they take the chip out of his head anyway, but that stuff's never brought up again. This doesn't even have the effect of them being like, and now somebody's injured because of this whole fight sequence. Like, no, we just didn't need that at all. It didn't make any sense, and we didn't need it, and it didn't end up affecting anything because they removed the chip from his head anyway. There's so many action sequences in this book that go nowhere and do nothing to the plot. They just happen, and nothing changes. And whatever events happen after those action sequences would have happened without that action sequence at all. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but it's like they go to this Hans guy and they have them remove their chips. And there's this entire scene of Thomas freaking out, and then they remove the chip. And if you took out the him freaking out part, you could just read the book and it would still make sense. Like the him freaking out part changed absolutely nothing about anything. They don't even reference the injuries anybody has from this fight sequence afterwards. Like it affects actually nothing. And it's so frustrating. Like this kind of stuff happens so often in this book and it's so frustrating. And the next 4 or 5 series of events are exactly the same, okay? Because then they decide to take a few days to rest from this procedure. And at some point, they're at a coffee shop in Denver and they see a guy who's on something called the Bliss, which is a drug that people can take to prolong their life after they get the flare, because the flare eats your brain. And so if your brain isn't operating at full capacity, then it eats your brain slower. And so people take this drug called the Bliss and it kind of makes them out of it. And that helps prolong their life through the flare, but it also makes them kind of strung out, for lack of a better way of putting it. So Thomas sees this guy and figures he's on the Bliss, but he forgets, like he's immune, right? So he doesn't have to be really worried about contracting the flare. And in this scene kind of seems to forget there's a bunch of people in the room that might not be immune and they might all get the flare from this guy. Somebody else ends up reporting the guy for being on the Bliss, and these people show up to capture him and take him away from everybody else. And everybody else evacuates the building when this happens, but Thomas doesn't. Everything about this scene pisses me off so much. He's so stupid. Thomas is such a stupid person. We are led to believe that he is like so intelligent and so perfect to be there, whatever, towards the end of the book. We'll get there. Oh my God, I don't even know like how to begin to break down. Like it does not cross his mind at all that it would be weird to any of the people going to capture this guy that somebody isn't afraid of contracting the flare from him, and that they would just like stand there and watch this whole thing go down while everybody else ran screaming. And everybody else in his group left too. He was the only person who didn't. He just watches this whole thing go down, and then he has this really weird interaction with a guard where the guard tells him, oh, I'm gonna sell you for so much money because you're immune, and is essentially trying to kidnap him. But then Thomas is saved by a police vehicle, and it turns out that that police vehicle is being operated by Jansen from Wicked, who then tells him that he is the final candidate, which means that they need him for the cure, although they won't tell him why, and they ask him to voluntarily return to the Wicked headquarters so that he can help them with the cure. And one of the things that he tells Thomas to try and manipulate him is that if he helps them with the cure, that it would save Newt, because Newt has the flare. He's like, yeah, but I just don't trust you guys. I don't think you're telling me the truth. And then immediately after that, they all find out via a note that Newt has been kidnapped. Oh, I forgot to mention, when they went into the city, they left Newt outside because he's not immune, right? And so he had the flare, so he wasn't going to be allowed into the city. So they had left him in the Burg, which is what they call these like helicopter things in the series. They had left him in the Burg, and so they go back to him after this whole thing, and they find out via a note he leaves behind that people had forced their way onto the Burg, found out that he was a crank, and had sent him to what they call the Crank Palace, which is a city that they essentially created to send people to when they have the flare. It was an attempt at being a little bit more humane to give them a place to go instead of just banishing them from society. But because this disease makes you slowly go insane and get very violent, these areas are very dangerous. So the group decides to go to the Crank Palace to save Newt, but they show up and they find out that Newt actually wants to stay there. He doesn't want to go with them because he's like, guys, I do have the flare. I can feel the effects on me already. I can feel that it's affecting me. I don't want to put you guys at risk, and I don't want you to see me like that, and I'm going to die from this anyway, so please leave me here. And the group doesn't really want to do that, and Newt seems particularly angry at Thomas, and Thomas doesn't really understand why until after they agree to leave him there and leave, and Thomas is like, oh yeah, he gave me that note a while back. I should probably read that now. And he reads the note, and the note is Newt asking that Thomas kills him. And the note is basically him saying, I don't want to die from the flare. I don't want to lose my mind. I don't want to go crazy. Will you please just kill me? Okay, why did he not just have that conversation with Thomas? Because handing him a note like this sets up exactly this scenario, which is that Thomas had not read the note, so he didn't know that that was what Newt wanted. So he was with Newt, and Newt was all pissed off that Thomas had never killed him. But you told him in a note to do that you told him when he first gave him the note not to read right then, and said you'll read this when the time is right. How is Thomas supposed to know what the time is right means? If you wanted him to kill you once the flare really started to take hold of your brain, you probably should have just told him that and had a whole conversation with him. Like, why leave him a note to tell him exactly that and to tell him not to read it until the time is like, it just, nothing about it makes sense. Nothing about anything in this book makes sense, okay? Thomas is like, oh shoot, Newt wanted me to kill him, that's why he's so mad at me, but I don't think I'd have been able to do it anyway, so it doesn't really affect anything that I didn't read the note, whatever. And then they all move on. I mean, not whatever, they're upset about Newt, but still, the story continues. Then they go back to Denver, and they are also kidnapped. They are kidnapped by the group that has been kidnapping the Immunes to give them back to Wicked. And when they're amongst the other people in the group, they realize that they're all the other kids who had escaped Wicked. And they're immediately like, hey, Teresa, hey, everybody, why didn't you guys come back for us? And they're like, wait, what? Why didn't you come back for us? They told us that you guys had escaped already. So it turns out that Wicked, for some reason, had told the one group of kids that the other group had escaped without them, and then vice versa. And so both groups of kids were under the impression that the other group left them behind. That doesn't affect anything and never comes up again, by the way. So now the group is all together, and there's strength in numbers, and so they're really pushing back against the people who have kidnapped them, and they're insisting to know what's going on. And the group is like, well, we don't really know what's going on. We're not really told all the big bad plans. We're just told we work for the right arm, and this has something to do with taking down Wicked, actually. And so they end up taking Thomas and Brenda to meet with their leader. There's another intense action sequence that has zero effect on the events of the plot itself, of them trying to get from the bunker they were all in to meeting with the leader, where there's a bunch of cranks that attack them. And then they find out from the leader that the whole plan is to fake sell all of these kids to Wicked as a way into the headquarters, and then they're actually going to fight Wicked once they're inside. And with the leader, they hatch the plan of dropping Thomas off nearby and having him walk over and voluntarily turn himself in so that he can set up a device that will shut down all of the weapons that Wicked has, because for some reason all of them require some kind of electromagnet whatever to operate, and so they can have some kind of machinery that shuts them down. By the way, some of the weapons Wicked has are just normal guns, and they're always just described as guns, but then they say even the guns will be disarmed by this. Like, why? Why would a normal gun be disarmed by some kind of electromagnetic disruptor situation? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. As I've already mentioned, nothing in this series makes sense. It doesn't matter. Point is, they get Thomas inside first so that he can set this thing up, because it'll disarm all the Wicked weapons, and then that way it'll be a relatively even playing field, and so that way they can get inside and fight them. Cool. So then they go to execute this plan. And while they are going to get to the Berg airport thing to be able to go do some of this stuff, they see a big group of cranks. And Newt is in the group of cranks that have broken into Denver essentially to attack everybody. Why is he with them? He went to the Crank Palace to die. He was trying to die separately. And now he's here, but he's not here and crazy to the point where he doesn't know himself at all. Like, the explanation for this is not that he's completely lost himself, because he's begging to Thomas's face for Thomas to kill him. Well, first of all, I hate to say this so crassly, but why does he never take his own life? If he's still that aware of himself, then why not just take his own life? So he's still that aware of himself, but he went on this raid of Denver with the other cranks anyway. He's not so far gone that he even attacks Thomas. He's just begging Thomas to kill him, and Thomas eventually agrees. And this just serves to be a big emotional impact on us, the reader, but it has no impact on me whatsoever, because all of the events that had to lead up to this happening make no sense whatsoever. So I just didn't care. I didn't care about anything that happened. I was just suffering my way through the rest of the events of the plot for content. So it had no impact on me whatsoever, because it was just so ridiculous and so stupid. The birds are chirping heavy outside my window again. I don't know why. It's 2 p.m. in Phoenix, Arizona in June. It's like 105 degrees out there. Why are they not sleeping? I'm not sure. But I'm on a roll. I'm not stopping, okay? So just enjoy the lovely chirping birds in the background. So anyway, this event happens, and then they all just go get on the Bergs to go execute their whole plan to invade Wicked. They drop Thomas off outside of the headquarters, and he hikes in, turns himself in, sets up the device, and then they pull him into a room where they tell him that he's the final candidate, that they need him for the cure, but what they need is his brain. They need his brain, and so they need to kill him so that they can study his brain, because he is the final candidate, and this is going to help them find the cure. Why? And so we are told that the whole entire events of this series are in an attempt to make this cure, and that they put all these kids through these crazy experiments and study their brain patterns to find the final candidate, and that with that final candidate, they can take their brain and potentially make a cure. There are so many problems with this, and James Dashner just doesn't even attempt to answer any of the issues with this. First of all, if their goal was the least death possible, because they also tell Thomas that they've been pretty sure it was either going to be him or Teresa for a long time, and that they ended up choosing him over Teresa, and that he's the final candidate because of the brain patterns. But then they also say that the trials were their attempt to find the final candidate with the least death possible, instead of just randomly killing immunes until they found the right brain. If you knew it was between two people for a long time, then why not just kill both those people? I'm pretty sure like 25 teenagers die over the course of this book series. If they had just killed Thomas and Teresa up front, then that is way less death. If they said their goal was to find the final candidate with the least death possible, and they were that sure from the start of the experiment that it was probably going to be either Thomas or Teresa, why not just kill them both first, study their brains, and if neither of them were the right person, then maybe consider another way of finding the final candidate? But not only that, I just cannot wrap my brain around why they would have needed a specific one of these immunes. Why on earth would it only have been one of them as well? Like, where did they get the idea that they needed that at all? If all of their brains were immune, then couldn't any of their brains have told them how a brain resists the flare? Thomas is not like more immune than anybody else. And so it doesn't work because we're given just enough to know that the explanation makes no sense whatsoever and nothing else. The entire series is based around this, and all of the motivation of the big bad that caused all of this to happen is based around the creation of this cure. So the explanation on how the cure would be created is way more important in a setting like this. Unfortunately, James Dashner didn't have the luxury of just being able to say, yeah, that's how they make the cure, and I'm not going to give you the details because it doesn't really matter. Because the details do matter. The details do matter because this is the entire explanation for the motivation behind the big bad. So if we don't have a solid explanation there, then nothing in this story makes any sense whatsoever. Why did they do any of this? So anyway, there's then an entire chapter of Thomas being like, oh my God, I need to stall as long as possible because if they actually kill me to take my brain before everybody breaks in to destroy Wicked, then I'm gonna die, and I don't particularly want to die. So he's trying to stall, but it's not really working, and in the end they end up putting him under. And then guess what? That's another action sequence that goes nowhere and affects nothing, because he just wakes up to a note from Chancellor Paige, who's the overarching leader of Wicked, saying that she saved him and delayed his procedure, and just telling him that she set up a safe haven for all of the immunes, and that she has made her peace with the fact that there is no cure, and that the only hope for the future of humanity is to take all the kids that are immune and put them in a safe spot away from any of the cranks who would go crazy and get really violent and kill them, so that they can continue the human race after everybody else is dead from the flare. And that Jorge and Brenda have been helping her move towards that outcome, that she brought them in specifically for that. So he finds all of this out from the note, and also finds out that there's a bunch of immunes being hidden in the maze. This just serves as a way for Thomas to return back to the maze as an homage to the very first book that started in the maze, which would be great if the events of the series post-maze had made any sense, and if we, the reader, weren't sitting here in this moment thinking, none of this makes sense, the maze doesn't make sense, them sending them to the Scorch doesn't make sense, and now this whole finale doesn't, like, none of this makes sense. So he goes back to the maze, and it's just this contrast that makes you remember where we started this series and how wild this whole journey has been, and not in an entertaining way, but in a ridiculous way. And so it's kind of the opposite of the effect it's probably supposed to have, where it's supposed to make us go, oh, think about the beginning of this journey, think of how far we've come, like how full circle, how great. But in reality, I'm just sitting there reminded of how ridiculous the whole maze part of these events was to begin with. So anyway, Thomas goes back to the maze, he finds all the immunes there, and he starts to try and free everybody. But then a bunch of bombs start going off, and he realizes that the right arm is bombing the building, trying to kill everybody inside. And all of a sudden he's thinking to himself, oh my God, I shouldn't have partnered them. Like, I guess we actually weren't aligned on our goals. What? Fully, we're like, yeah, we want to break in and disarm all of Wicked's weapons so that we have a better chance at fighting them and stopping them. I mean, did you think Wicked would just go nicely? Did you think they weren't going to have to kill anybody to make this happen? And yeah, bombing the building and therefore risking everybody inside is not how they told him they were going to do it. But I don't really think Thomas has a leg to stand on here to say, I didn't realize they were going to kill anybody. Not to mention that I'm pretty sure he kills Jansen. I don't know, I didn't write that down, but I'm pretty sure he kills Jansen. So he kills somebody, but he thinks that the way the right arm went about killing everybody wasn't fair, and he's like scoffing at them and frowning on them when he's done the same thing, basically. And also, how did you not realize that that's what they were gonna do? Maybe not in that way, but how did you not realize they were gonna end up killing people? And then Teresa dies as they're trying to escape. She sacrifices herself to save Thomas, and the rest of them make it through the flat trans to the safe haven location. And the book ends with all of the immunes in the safe haven away from everybody, about to start their own society. And that's the end of the series. That's the end of the Death Cure. Now, I will say, I've been venting about the whole book and I'm about to insult it even more. So I will take the opportunity to tell you essentially the one thing that I liked about this book that reflects back on the whole series that I think is really good, which is this ending. I actually really like the idea of most of the book series was dedicated towards creating some kind of cure for this crazy illness. And in the end, they aren't able to make the cure. And so they just separate out the people who are immune to carry on the human race after everybody else is gone. I like that as a plot twist ending to a story like this, because it kind of feels like the only other two endings are that everybody dies or that they do find a cure. I liked it as an ending. I thought it was a fun ending. But everything that got us there was ridiculous and it was completely unearned. Not to mention, it was all pointless once again. Because let me point something out to you, that if you're not thinking overarchingly about the plot of this book, you might not have caught, but all of these kids started in Wicked custody and then escaped and ended up back inside the Wicked building, where Thomas just wakes up to a note from the leader of Wicked saying that she had been setting this up and that they all just need to get through this flat trans to get to this safe haven, which means that exactly like the Scorch trials, the entire events of this book could have not happened and the outcome in the end would have been the same. If all of the kids had just stayed in the Wicked headquarters, then Chancellor Paige would have freed them and sent them to the safe haven anyway. So everything that happens in this book is pointless. And Newt would have died anyway because he had the flare and they never made a cure. And so the Scorch trials started and ended in exactly the same place and essentially nothing had changed. And in this book, the book starts and ends not in the exact same place necessarily, but none of the events of the book had to happen to make the ending happen. If the kids had never escaped, they would have just been freed by Chancellor Paige and the same ending would have happened. A note to any of you who are writing your own book: if you could cut out the entirety of the plots of book 2 and book 3 and have had the ending of the overall series be identical to what the ending is with all of that plot and action, you need to take a step back and start over, to be honest. The plot is supposed to lead somewhere. I'm going crazy. I feel like I have the flare. I'm losing my mind. The events of the series are supposed to have an impact on the ending. You could have ended this whole entire series at the end of book 1 and literally just have told the kids after they got out of the maze, yeah, we did this because all of you are immune and we were studying your brainwaves. But it turns out that we don't think we're going to be able to make the cure. We thought this would work, but it's not really working. So we're actually just going to send you guys all to a safe haven to continue the human race. I feel like I'm gonna get some kind of comment from somebody saying, well, you could in theory do that with any book series and just skip to the ending if you have the right setup for it. But no, because part of the point that I'm making here is that the children and their actions and the plot that they partake in have zero impact in anything that happens, essentially. Everything they do is pointless. So if we had seen them create the safe haven or something, or set up the whole plan for them to escape to the safe haven, then it would have been entirely different. The reason why it all feels so pointless is because they were not the ones to do that. It was just done for them by somebody else. Once again, coming back to something that I've complained about throughout this entire book series, which is that the kids themselves solve none of these problems, and all of them are always solved for them. This YA book series has the opposite problem that most young adults of this style have, because these are ultimately genres that are written for kids and teens, and so they want to read their own self-insert. They want to read a character that they identify with. Cool, great, makes sense. So you've got to have the kids and teens be the ones solving the problem, and so you have to justify that as the author, and sometimes that's very difficult. And so when you're reading young adult as an adult, sometimes you have to suspend your disbelief that it is kids and teens solving all these issues and move on. But this book has the opposite problem. It's a young adult where the young adults in it do nothing, and the problems actually are all solved by the adults around them, all the way back to the beginning of the series. My big complaint about the first book was that it wasn't the kids who found their own way out of the maze. They needed to be given every hint in the book, and in the end, Thomas just had to get his memories back and remember what the solution to the maze was, because he was one of the people who set it up. So they did not solve the maze by themselves, and then nothing in the Scorch Trials matters at all, because they end up right back where they started, and then Chancellor Paige is the one who sets up the safe haven, and the kids are just sent there at the end of the book, and there's no setup or action from them whatsoever. And so the finale isn't satisfying because there was no journey to it. We went on a very long journey, but it was aimless. It went a bunch of different places. None of those places mattered, and the end was just handed to us. And so the ending isn't satisfying because it's not one that we earned. It's not one the characters earned. They did nothing to deserve this. They did nothing to create this safe haven. They did nothing to deserve any of the bad things that happened to them in the series either, but still, from a narrative, storytelling perspective, this is a horrible ending because there's no setup for it, and there's no journey to it. There's a journey, and then we're just plopped in this ending, but the journey didn't lead to the ending. You see what I'm saying? And to make matters just exponentially worse, we once again have a Wicked memo epilogue that gives us, the reader, a little bit of information that is supposed to be a plot twist, high impact ending, where we find out that not only was the flare a man-made virus, which we learned in book 2, but that Wicked intentionally released it after the solar flares destroyed the Earth around the equator because we were low on resources, and so they were trying to curb the population down to a number where the Earth would have enough resources left to support what the population now was. What? They intentionally released a man-made virus that they did not have a cure for, that caused people to go insane and get super violent before they eventually died of it, and is also highly contagious via air. I've got to be honest with you guys, I feel like it is very obvious up front that that is a situation that would get out of control very quickly. Why would they not release a bioweapon that just makes people sick and die? And why would they not choose one that they had a cure for already so that they could control the spread of it? Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. My overarching opinion on the series at large, and James Dashner as an author, it goes back to something I said about the first book, which is that it feels like he thinks through problems to one level, but that the second you think of things any deeper than that, all of it falls apart and none of it makes any sense whatsoever. And so in a true homage to my own content about young adult novels from my childhood, I have actually written a skit for this video because I feel like there's no other way to truly capture exactly what I mean when I say this. So please enjoy. Thank you for sitting down with me. Of course, happy to be here. Yeah, I just have some clarifying questions about the logic in the series. Yeah, of course. It's revealed in the epilogue of The Death Cure that Wicked intentionally released the flare virus as a bioweapon for population control. Why would they release a virus that they didn't have a cure to for population control? Right, but you would think that they would pick something that they had a cure to. It's for population control. Okay, but why did they pick a virus that they didn't have a cure to? And why would they pick one that makes people really violent and makes them want to kill each other? I just feel like it's really obvious that something like this would have gotten out of hand very quickly. It's for population control. I don't understand what's confusing about that. All right, we'll just move on then. How were they able to engineer the virus but not the cure? It was a bioweapon. Well, yeah, so it was obviously more important that they had the virus than the cure. But why were they able to engineer the virus? Like, they made the virus. It was a man-made virus. They were able to create the virus, but they weren't able to create the cure. It was a bioweapon they released for population control. I feel like we're going in circles. Okay. So now the flare is out there, right? Flare's out there and they need a cure. So they released it without having a cure for some reason. And there are these young people that are immune. So they round them up to study them. Makes sense? And they put them in a maze like lab rats, right? Exactly. See, you get it. Okay, where did they get the resources for the maze? Well, the government's pulled their resources together. Right. For a maze to study their brainwaves, why would they not just stress them out in a cheaper way? It's a maze. They're like lab rats. You said that. They're studying them. Well, right. That's why you, the author, wanted the maze. But why in universe would the government choose a maze? Because they're lab rats. They're lab rats in a maze. Okay, we'll just move on to the next question. So they decide the maze trial has gone on way too long. So they rush the end game, right? They keep the walls open at night. They're sending the grievers to take a kid a day. And all of this is to rush the end of the maze trial, only to immediately take all these kids and stick them in another trial. Why not just continue the maze trial if they didn't have everything they needed? Well, they weren't getting everything they needed from the maze trial, so they needed to up the ante a little bit. So that's why they ended the maze trial, went into the next one. Oh, okay, yeah, and answer. Finally. So they do the maze, and then they go to the desert to study them to find the cure. Right, about that. How does studying their brainwaves lead to a cure? They need the patterns. What are the patterns? Patterns of brainwaves. And this helps them get the cure. How? No, they can't make the cure with just the patterns. They need the final candidate. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So if they're all immune, why did they need a specific final candidate to be the one whose brain they studied? If all of their brains are immune, they could have studied any of them and got the answers they needed about the brain structure, no? Because they needed the final candidate. The candidate they used the trials to find. Why did they need a final candidate? Like, if all they needed was the brain structure, any of their brains would have worked, no? Because that's what they needed. I don't understand what you want from me. Okay, so did the patterns of the brainwaves help them find the final candidate, or did they need the patterns and the final candidate to make the cure? Unclear. What? Well, at one point I say the patterns were to find the final candidate, but then later in the same chapter, I say that they need the patterns and the final candidate's brain to make the cure. Yeah, so which is it? Who's to say? I would think you are. No, there's no way to know. Okay, last question. So Jansen, aka Ratman, tells Thomas that they did the trials in order to find the final candidate with as little death as possible. But at many points in the series, it's revealed that they suspected that Thomas was going to be the final candidate from pretty early in, or at least that it was between him and Teresa, right? Yes, all correct. Are you aware that 25 teenagers die over the course of the books? Yeah, I made it pretty gruesome. Right, but if their goal is the least death possible, then couldn't they have just killed Thomas and Teresa? And one of them would have been the final candidate, probably. All the smart people died during the solar flares. Yeah, I gathered that. This book made me so angry I wrote a skit. And as much as I'm complaining about it with this book, this actually is a classic problem with dystopians. And I talked about it with the Divergent series as well. But it's when authors just need to invent a big bad. And so they invent a big bad government, but they don't give that much thought into why the government is doing what it's doing. And so if you think about it more than one level deep at all, then the whole premise of everything just kind of falls apart. I mean, there are plenty of evil and corrupt governments and people in power in this world that you could totally base a dystopian government around, but people aren't just evil for the sake of being evil. They usually have a reason for doing what they're doing. Not that that makes it justified, not that that makes it right, but usually they have some kind of reason. The Hunger Games is obviously the peak of the genre, the staple, and that makes it a really good example for this. The Capitol are the big bad. They are the evil ones, right? And the reason why they do everything they do is because they want to have all their little trinkets and their little treats and to have their lovely luxury lifestyles, but the only way for them to have those is to profit off of the work of all of the other districts and to essentially have all these other districts that are incredibly mistreated and work very hard to provide them those trinkets and those little joys, right? That is an example of an evil dystopian government that does what it does for a reason. And the Capitol and the districts are supposed to be modeled after America and our impact on the overall world. And you can see that in it. It's like a version of that that's turned up to 11 to make a point. And that's when dystopian is at its best, is when an author sees something in the world that they don't like and takes that and bases a government around it and then uses that to send the message. But this is like, this government is just evil to be evil. You could say they're evil to make the cure, but everything about their explanation as to how they're making the cure, none of it makes any sense whatsoever. And so it just feels like James Dashner was trying to think of a horrible situation to put these kids in just for the sake of putting them in a horrible situation for the book, but there's no thought given to whether or not the situation would ever happen in real life. And again, I just come back to, at the very least, the behavior of the characters in Divergent and the plot led to the outcome. So I can give Divergent that, and I can't even give this book series this, because all of the characters and all of their actions could have not happened and the same exact ending would have happened. In fact, I would argue that even the events of the original book don't matter, because if they had never gotten out of the maze, then Chancellor Paige would have freed them anyway and sent them to the safe haven anyway. And so you could actually make the argument that all three of the books are pointless and that this ending would have happened no matter what. It has the inadvertent effect of making basically every character in the series look very stupid as well. But I am not done complaining, because all that I have really harped on throughout all three of these books is the unrealistic aspects of them, because that is the thing that has stuck out to me the most. But here in the finale, I also want to highlight some of my issues with James Dashner's writing that I just haven't gotten the chance to talk about up to now, because I've been so distracted by all of these other problems. And I have two major complaints about it. The first is the slang, the Gladers slang that they develop in the Glade when they're all isolated for 2 years, right? I'm not saying it's unrealistic that an isolated community kept separate for 2 years in their own bubble wouldn't develop their own slang terms. Like, I actually think that that would happen. My issue with it is more that I don't really understand how these phrases came to be. A lot of them linguistically don't make sense in the way they developed, and they're very lazy. So it doesn't actually really feel like something that immerses the reader in the story as much as it feels like a cheap trick that James Dashner was trying to use to delineate the Gladers from the other characters throughout the whole entire series. There's a specific word, shuck, that is used in exactly the same way that we would use our curse word, fuck. And they're only 2 letters apart, so it feels incredibly lazy. And it does lead you to wonder how that developed, because it doesn't really feel realistic to me that a group of teen boys would drop the F-bomb and then be like, no, we can't say that. Let's say shuck instead. We'll all know we're saying fuck, and almost voluntarily censor themselves. And otherwise, I don't know how they accidentally would have created a word that is so close to a curse word we actually use. But not only that, there's one specific way in which they use it, in which we do use the word fuck, but in a different form, and they don't use the different form in the book. And so it's so jarring when you read it. Instead of saying, could you be fucking quiet, they would say, could you be shuck quiet? It was so jarring to read every time I read it. It never felt natural. It yanked me out of the reading experience every single time. I thought about it literally every time they said that, and it's so often. Shuck is the most common of this slang that they use in the whole entire series. And again, it's like, it's so lazy. It's so lazy to just have it be our curse word but 2 letters off. And then if you're gonna do that, just have them use it in exactly the same way, or else it's so jarring for the reader because it's so similar to a word that we have, and its use is basically the same in every other situation except this one. And so it makes it so hard to read. But not only that, my other issue with the Glader slang is that nobody, and I mean nobody, in the rest of the book series ever says to them, what? What does that mean? Like, they use this slang not just with each other, but with other people. And now that I'm saying this out loud, there is a potential, and I'm not going back to check because it doesn't matter, and my point still stands with everybody else. There is a potential that Jorge does that in the second book. There are so many points throughout the series where these characters meet different people who weren't in the Glade, and they use these slang terms, and either nobody ever calls them on it, or I have this like faint memory that potentially Jorge does. If somebody's saying a word in front of you and you don't know what it means and it's important to the sentence that they're saying, then you would think you would ask, especially if you're using it to delineate the Gladers from the non-Gladers in the series. Then you would think that all of the characters that weren't Gladers that don't use these slang terms wouldn't know what they meant, but they're used in front of them all the time and it's never brought up. And so that's why I'm saying it doesn't really matter to me. Like, I have a faint memory of potentially a conversation with Jorge where he's like, wait, what does that mean? But that almost makes it worse to me because that's James Dashner acknowledging that that's the case and then not doing that with any of the other characters. Either nobody ever does, or there's one time where one character does and otherwise it doesn't happen. So do you see what I'm saying? I don't think it actually matters to go back and double check, but maybe that's just me being lazy. I don't know. You guys might be mad at me for that. But my other major issue with the writing is something that I've mentioned before in passing, and it is an extension on what I just ranted about with the plot basically leading nowhere. But this book series, I would almost recommend you read if you're writing your own book series as a what not to do when it comes to showing versus telling. Because you've probably heard people say that a million times. You want to show the reader what's happening, not tell. And if you remember back to my video about the first Maze Runner book, one of the big things I talked about was that there was a scene where Thomas goes back and gets his memories back of making the maze so that he can remember what the solution to the maze was. And instead of us seeing him going through those memories, we get a scene of him recounting those memories to the other Gladers. And he's just telling them what he remembered. That continues throughout the whole entire series. So there's a few examples I've already brought up that I'm going to go back to and explain this with those scenes so that you can see what I mean. Biggest offender in this book for me was the scene where Thomas goes back to the Wicked headquarters. Because what happens is he goes back and he has a sit-down conversation where Jansen explains to him everything to do with him being the final candidate, which that, sure, fine, okay, whatever. If that's how he finds out about the final candidate stuff, I'm not that mad about that. And then there's this whole entire action sequence of him trying to stall and trying to buy himself time for the invasion to happen and trying to save his own life that way. And he ends up being put under anyway. And then he wakes up to a note from Chancellor Paige explaining about the safe haven, and then they just go to the safe haven. And so there's this action sequence in the middle that leads nowhere and does nothing, and it's bookended by two conversational moments. Technically, it's a note, not a conversation with Chancellor Paige, but you get what I'm saying. Thomas is just told he's the final candidate, and then a bunch of action happens. The action doesn't matter, and then he's just told about the safe haven. The whole entire book series is that. It basically alternates between dialogue that moves the story along and action and plot that doesn't matter at all. And so I've covered how at a broad level none of the events matter because we could get from the beginning to the end without any of this happening canonically. But on a small level, every single plot point, like every time the journey is moved along that the characters are on, it's moved along in the dialogue. It's never moved along by the action unless somebody dies. Like somebody actively dying is the only time that the action actually impacts the result. Otherwise, it's all dialogue. You see what I'm saying? So we're always told what the next step is. We're always told what the next plot point is, what the next reveal is. All the characters are always just telling each other what's going on or telling each other what they want to do next. I don't know if what I'm saying is going to make sense, but it's just, I'll go back to, I almost recommend this as a what not to do if you're working on your own book, as how not to do your plot development, because we're told everything, we're never shown anything, and everything we are shown doesn't matter in the end. So all of that to say, wasn't for me. I didn't like it. 0 stars. But now, let's talk about the third movie, which is actually very similar to the second movie in the way that it loosely follows some of the plot events of the book, but gives entirely different motivations for them, and once again makes things a lot more seamless. And I actually did like the movie a lot better than I liked the book. Now, I'm going to say that with an asterisk, because it was in researching this movie after having watched it that I found out about something that I didn't know about when I made my first 2 videos, which is that Dylan O'Brien was actually really injured over the course of filming this movie, and they had to postpone filming for a while. And he was injured in a stunt. He was pulled off of the top of one moving vehicle and he got struck by another. So this led him to be very injured, and they had to wait until he recovered to finish filming the movie. According to him, he had some safety concerns about that stunt and they weren't listening to him. And that does make me really upset. Again, I didn't know that when I was talking about the other movies. And I think it's important to talk about, because I think it's obviously really important that stunts are done safely, and nobody's lives or safety should ever be put at risk in the name of making a movie. It's just not that serious. It's never that serious. You're making a movie. I understand that stunts are a part of making movies, but if you can't do them safely, then you shouldn't do them. And it really, the thing that sickens me specifically is that he had safety concerns and expressed that, and they didn't listen to him. And then he was so badly injured that they had to postpone filming. It's just really sad, and it makes me not want to say good things about the movie, but I'm going to try and not let that affect my opinion of it. I really do think they did a better job with it than the book. I feel like it's proof of the theory, if you've ever heard anybody say, that it's actually not always the best idea to adapt a really good book. There's a school of thought that the best books to adapt to movies are books that had good concepts that weren't executed well. A movie is a different medium than a book, so you're always going to have to make some changes to make it work for the different medium. And so if the original book series had some issues in the execution, then when you make those changes, that makes those changes look really good instead of bad, if that makes sense. And I think that this is the perfect example of that, because I really do think that the movie is way better than the book, and that the movie series overall is way better than the book series. It's way more seamless, it's way more cohesive, and it makes so much more sense. Now, I did also watch it with my dad. He gave it 3.5 stars instead of the 3 he gave the second movie. I'm still giving it a flat 3. I don't think they're the best, most life-changing movies ever made, but I essentially have the same perspective on it that I had on the second movie, which is that if you go into it expecting a young adult dystopian, it's going to be exactly what you're expecting it to be. And I do think the movie series is somewhat worth checking out if you've never seen it. I do not think the book series is really worth checking out at all. I would only recommend it if you're looking for an example of what not to do on show versus tell. And otherwise, I don't really think it's worth anybody's time, to be honest. I only had really 2 complaints about this third movie, which is that they never fixed the plot hole that if all they need is blood, why do they have to abuse the kids and treat them so poorly? That doesn't make any sense. And one of the things that's different about this movie than the book series is that they're able to separate some enzyme from the blood of the immunes in order to prolong people's lives when they have the flare, but that's not a cure. And so all of the stuff that Wicked's doing in the movie series is to find an actual cure instead of just something that postpones people dying of the virus. But it turns out that Thomas's enzymes are potent enough, if you will, that if you use his enzymes from his blood, then you actually will cure somebody. So they end up discovering this at some point in this third movie, and he does actually cure Brenda. If you remember, Brenda was infected with the flare in the movie series. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I don't want to bother breaking down the whole entire plot of the movie because I don't think it really matters, but I will just say that that is what the cure ends up being in the movie. But then they do this really, really weird ending that made both me and my dad go, huh? Because it turns out that Jansen actually was the big bad the entire time in the movie version, and Jansen wants this cure to be able to enrich himself off of selling it to people. And so he's trying to kidnap Thomas, essentially. And Teresa and him end up fighting back against Jansen. And at some point in that conversation, Jansen is like, well, he didn't really earn that he's immune to the flare, and he didn't earn this cure. Like, why does he get to have this gift and nobody else? And Teresa says, I don't know, but it's his, or something like that. Then in the end, all the kids go to the safe haven, and Thomas fully knows that his blood and the enzymes in his blood will cure people with the flare, and he just goes with them to the safe haven. And the note from Newt, instead of saying, hey, please kill me, they just have that conversation in person, as it should have been in the book, but I digress. And so the note from Newt actually says that he knows Thomas will do the right thing when the time is right. And so this causes Thomas to kind of look off into the distance, and he's holding also a vial of the enzymes from his blood that he still has. Very obvious that he's thinking about whether or not he should go back to help distribute the cure. And that's the end of the movie. So we don't really get a concrete answer as to whether or not he does do that. And I honestly didn't really like that ending. It didn't feel satisfying, but I kind of get why they did it, because the alternative is that they did end up with a cure. That leaves room for an interpretation that it was all worth it in the end because they did end up with a cure, which is probably not a message that they wanted to have. And so by not concrete showing, yay, they have a cure now, they can distribute it to people, so it was all worth it, they can kind of avoid that message. Sometimes an ambiguous ending can be satisfying. Inception is the most famous example. I really like the ending of Inception, and I think that when done well, it can be very satisfying, even though you don't get a concrete answer. But it's not done well here. It doesn't feel satisfying at all. And I feel like I would have rather them pick one or the other. I would have rather them just have Thomas be like, you know what, we've all suffered enough. We're all just going to continue the human race. How would they even distribute the cure anyway? We might as well just all separate ourselves, whatever. And if that makes him look like a bad person, then fine. Not everybody's perfect in a story, right? And if you don't agree with him choosing that as the viewer, then fine. But maybe he chooses that, or maybe he chooses to stay behind when everybody else goes to the safe haven and allow them to make the cure from his blood and stay there, right? I think they should have picked one or the other. I think leaving it ambiguous was just unsatisfying. I just didn't love it as an ending. But I otherwise thought the movie series was much better than the books, and I would way sooner recommend somebody watch these movies than I would recommend somebody reads these books. I pretty much only think the books are worth reading if you want an example of what not to do with show versus tell. Otherwise, I think you can skip them. I think these are not really books anybody needs to read. And that was my overall opinion. What did you guys think? Have you ever read this? A lot of you have told me over the course of these videos that you had read the first two books and DNF'd it at some point in the third. Now that I've read the third, if you remember what your final straw was, definitely let me know because I'm very curious about it. At what point in the book did you put it down? But honestly, it doesn't surprise me that that happened with a lot of people because, like I said, this is really not a very good book in my opinion, and I wasn't really a huge fan of it. Yeah, let me know if you've read it. Did you make it all the way through? Did you DNF it? If you DNF'd it, at one point did you do that? That's gonna be all for me today, you guys. This was a very fun revisit of this young adult series, and I definitely will be continuing it. I already know what book series I want to do next, but I have some other video ideas as well. I actually have a really fun book I just found at the store that I'm very excited about. That's probably going to be the next video. Definitely subscribe if you don't want to miss more series like this. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!